We warmly welcome you all to our podcast series, the ONTOPIC'22, organized by the Commerce Society of Royal College, where we have an interesting talk on training topics in the field of business and economy. In today's episode, we'll be diving deeper into the depths of some key aspects of the energy sector, which is a global training topic in the present world. Our guest today is the Chief of Energy Sector Group in Asian Development Bank and also a proud old boy of Royal College. I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Priyantha Wijayatunga to our podcast series. Thank you, sir, for taking time out of your very busy calendar to join us today. I'm Adam Dulshan, hosting this episode along with my colleague, Kalya Medananda.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Everyone, I'm Kalya Medananda. Let's now move on to the questions. So our first question: what is the current state of energy consumption in Sri Lanka, and how is it distributed among different sectors?
Yeah, of course, I have been out of Sri Lanka for some time, but as I can see from some of the statistics, overall annual consumption in Sri Lanka in electricity is roughly around 14 million units. 14,000 million units, actually 14,000 gigawatt hours. And out of this, quite a substantial, about 40% is consumed in the domestic sector, that means in the houses and so on, whereas another 30% or so in the industrial sector, and then about another 30% or so in the commercial sector. Then you have, of course, street lighting and religious purposes. They are more or less marginal, less than 1%. So overall, if you look at it, it's dominated by three sectors, that is subsectors: domestic, industrial, and commercial. And domestic is dominating.
Thank you, sir. So clearly, Sri Lanka does use a lot of various types of energy sources. So what are the main energy sources that we use in Sri Lanka, and how are they distributed among the people?
Yes. Sri Lanka, is blessed with obviously hydropower, as you know, and so we have had a lot of hydropower in the past. Actually, because the system was fully dominated by hydropower. But as the system grew and as the demand growth, picked up, naturally the hydropower resources became limited. And as a result, we started moving slowly to other sources, such as other thermal sources, mostly oil in the initial stages. Then, of course, coal power later on. So overall, now we have three dominant sources of primary energy used for electricity generation. Mainly hydropower, roughly about a third, and then another third coming from oil. And about 40%, two-thirds, one-third coming from coal power at the moment. These are the three different sources of primary energy which we use for electricity generation. So that's how it is. Yeah, of course, you have renewable energy like wind power, solar power, other renewable energies. Frankly, even hydropower is renewable energy. So other renewable energy sources also that substantial component, about I think 7 to 10% of energy comes from that also.
Right. So to be meeting that demand, Sri Lanka must be generating a lot of electricity. So what is the energy generation capacity of Sri
Lanka? Yeah. At the moment, the demand, when it comes to energy, as you know, energy and power, these are two different things. That means at a particular moment in time, you have to satisfy the megawatt demand. And at the same time, the system should be able to accommodate megawatt hours. So it's energy plus power both. In Sri Lanka, we have roughly about, if I can remember, about 3,000 megawatts of installed capacity, or just over 3,000. And our demand is about 2,500. But mind you, though you have about 3,000 megawatts, these numbers go down during the dry season because almost half of that 3,000 comes from hydropower. So when there is a dry season, naturally you cannot get all the capacity from hydropower from these generators. As a result, you might have a situation where the peak cannot be met adequately, because 3000 can go down to less than 2000, depending on the hydropower situation. And also availability of fuel. For instance, these days you have an issue of fuel availability. If there is an issue of fuel availability, then naturally the number of thermal power plants or those running with oil, the capacity will go down. It's the same story with coal power. If you have adequate coal, it's okay. But if there is an issue of coal, stocks, the capacity might go down, available capacity. But overall, you need roughly about 14,000 million units to supply the system. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, there's already a large amount of unavailability when it comes to these crucial energy sources, right? So how do you protect these energy sources for the usage from the future generations and stuff?
Yes, one thing, of course, we have to remember, all these fossil fuel systems are basically all imported fuels. For instance, coal, oil, and whatever fossil fuels be, all we have to import. So if you're talking about Sri Lanka itself, what we have is hydropower, and any other renewable energy sources you have, like wind power, solar power, and so on. So there is nothing like protecting these sources for the future generation, because these are renewable energy sources which are replenished, and you can use it as long as you want, because they are available more or less unlimited. Fossil fuel sources, there is nothing called leaving it to the future, because that's all imported. So as long as we have adequate supplies coming, then it's available for the future generation. Then the issue comes whether even outside, whether you have adequate resources of these fossil fuels available to be utilized. As you know, these are limited in availability, particularly oil. May not last long. So the less you use these sources, the better it is for the future generations. At the same time, of course, for the global warming issues. Yes.
One of the major trends currently in the world is renewable energy. So can you tell us what are the benefits which we gain as a nation by adapting to renewable energy sources?
Yeah, obviously, as I said, the biggest advantage is that these are indigenous sources. That means these are all, the primary sources available within the country. That means you don't have to spend money on it. Of course, you have to spend money for the technology to be used for electricity generation. But apart from the technology, there is no running cost, and all that is available locally free of charge. So that's the biggest thing. From energy security viewpoint, that's very, very useful, because as I said, at a time like this, when you have dollar crisis, you don't have to spend money on fuel as such. So that's the biggest advantage we have as renewable energy sources. And so it's true for other countries also. For energy resilience, energy security, renewable energy sources are the best. Then of course, you have other issues coming along with renewable energy, because as you know, the sun is not available all the time to generate solar power. You have almost 12 hours of sun during the day, but then you have 12 hours without sun. So if you are going to use solar power, you should have some way of storing this solar power. And there comes the battery technology. There comes the pump storage, hydro, something like that. So these, different technologies can be used to store energy. But then along with it comes the cost of storage. So these are some of the issues you need to address when you have renewable energy. But all in all, the more you use renewable energy, the better it is for Sri Lanka, because it's all local. But then the technology cost will have to be taken into consideration, whether it's affordable, whether the technology is available adequately for storage, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. So what are the new improvements in the energy sector globally?
New improvements, as I said, the trend is all renewable energy, because obviously renewable energy is the way forward, mainly to address the climate change issues. Globally, the only way that you can bring down global warming potential is by reducing as much as possible fossil fuel use. And the power generation sector is one of the sectors using enormous amount of fossil fuels. And the world trend is to move away from fossil fuel based generation to renewable energy generation based generation. And that's the trend, and the technology is improving. As a result, technology costs are coming down. As I said, intermittency is an issue, but the solutions for intermittency are coming, and they are being developed now, particularly battery technology and control systems and so on, they are coming up. So those costs also gradually coming down. So overall trend in the whole world is to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And it's even more emphasized now, as you can see in the recent, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has constrained a lot of energy supplies coming from Russia to the rest of Europe. And the Europe is seriously looking at how to accelerate moving towards renewable energy. So the world trend is to move towards renewable energy, particularly because of global warming issues. At the same time, of course, the issue of energy security, energy resilience.
It is very clear that the energy sector is growing extremely fast. So can you tell us what are the threats to the energy supply?
The threat is actually whether the technology is developing fast enough to move into these technologies, rather move away from greenhouse gas emitting technologies fast enough. That's the threat. That's a challenge. And as you know, we have to become net zero world by 2050 if we are to retain or keep the global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius within this century. Now, it's an enormous task. So the challenge is to develop the required technologies to bring about this net zero emission target reality, right? So that's the biggest challenge. And as a result, it's a threat also in a way. And at the same time, of course, there is a threat because the fossil fuel lobby all over the world, the fossil fuel, has a very strong lobby across the world, and so that is an issue too. At the same time, of course, renewable energy also has a lobby, and that is stronger too. So there are challenges like that, and also the systems have stranded assets, because if you move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and what do you do with the existing power plants? And these have been invested in by people, by various investors, and they need returns for that. So these are called stranded assets. Somebody will have to pay for it. So it's not easy to replace one power plant with another, because it involves money, it involves costs. And for instance, if the next board is to close down the coal power plant, and which is expected to run at least 30, 40 years now, and who is going to pay for those investments? And all of us will have to pay for it. So you have to look at those things also. It's not just replacement with renewable energy, which matters, but also the costs incurred for these stranded assets. And so these are some of the challenges we have to face, some of the barriers we have to face when it comes to moving into renewable energy. And also, we have to remember, now of course in Sri Lanka it's not a major issue, but in other countries, you have coal supplies, gas supplies, and there are a lot of people involved in this industry, and they survive, they rely on income from these industries. People who go into coal mines and coal miners, and those who work in these coal power plants. All these people will have to survive with the closing down of these coal power plants or fossil fuel power plants. So this is therefore is very important that we address this in a just way, or just, we call it just transition from polluting energy environment to non-polluting energy environment. So these are challenges we have, and we have to gradually address those.
Thank you, Doctor. What's your personal opinion on the current energy crisis that's happening in Sri Lanka and around the world?
Yeah, what you have around the world is, as I said, obviously, not unexpected energy supply disruptions. And that, of course, partly due to the COVID pandemic and so on, because naturally that has impacted the supply chain of all the fossil fuels and other sources. And even for renewable energy, the technology costs could have gone up because of the supply chain issues. And in Sri Lanka, of course, it's a little more than that, as you know very well. We have not had power plants are put up in time to supply the requirements, the demand. And it's important that you plan a generation system in advance, because there is a lead time to put up power plants and finally for them to come into operation. And it can be as long as 5-6 years for a thermal power plant like coal power or even gas-fired power station. It can be as long as about 3-4 years. And for a hydropower plant, it can be as long as about 10 years. So you need to plan these power plants well in advance and start working on those and to finally to get them online. So I don't think we have had those plans implemented in a timely manner to get the power generation capacity in place whenever it's required. So at the moment, the biggest problem is we don't have adequate generation capacity, number one. Even with the existing generators, we don't have adequate fuel to run it because of the fuel prices we have in Sri Lanka. So it's another issue, an additional issue. So these issues have eventually made the power system not being able to supply the demand required. So as a result, naturally, you have to have power interruptions. These are called planned power interruptions. Unless you have planned power interruptions, you do have enough generation capacity to supply. That means obviously demand supply gap will be there. And so that's the reason. Very simple.
Yes, sir. So what's your view on the current energy security of Sri Lanka?
In terms of energy security, of course, I would like to call it energy resilience, because energy security depends on whatever energy sources you have available locally. And countries like us may not be able to be fully self-sufficient in energy sources, simply because we don't have fossil fuel reserves. Of course, we have some gas reserves in offshore in Sri Lanka, but they may not be economical to be exploited at this stage, and also increasingly it's going to be tough to exploit these resources because of the climate change concerns. So we don't have fossil fuel resources, and that means we need to import them. And so what we have to ensure for energy security is to make sure that these imported fossil fuels supply chain is not disrupted, and we have adequate funds to pay for it. So in that sense, energy security means try to get as much energy as possible from what is available locally, that is things like hydropower, wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources. But of course, keeping in mind the intermittency of it and the need to have sometimes baseload power generation, based on fossil fuels. But then fossil fuel supplies will have to be there uninterrupted. So that supply chain issues need to be addressed, like what we have now, for instance. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So what's your advice that we can do for a sustainable energy plan which suits Sri Lanka so we can get out of this crisis and head towards a brighter future?
The most important thing is we should seriously look at how we can get the maximum out of renewable energy sources. We may be able to go beyond what we are doing now. And in fact, the current government's energy policy is that 70% of power generation will have to come from renewable energy by 2030. So it's only about 7 years away, 7 to 8 years away. So we should plan for it. And we have the technologies. Of course, as I said, you have to look at the costs. Always, you have a cost implication, and we have to check whether it's affordable. Naturally, we should be able to do that. So the advice is to get as much renewable energy as possible to the system, subject to obviously technical constraints, and we need to address those technical constraints with available technologies. And that's the best thing what we should be doing. Anyway, the government has a plan to get up to 70% of renewable energy by 2030. That is achievable because we have 7 years to go, and we should be aiming for it as much as possible.
Thank you, sir. That'll be all for today. Thank you a lot for joining with us today. Your presence and wise words helps us to magnify our cause in the best way possible, making this project a huge success. We look forward to our next interaction soon. Wishing you all the best for your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me for this program. And I hope you got enlightened a little more than what you are now at the moment.